Hello everybody, welcome back to Simple Gaming Review. Today I want to make a quick video about the OG game console wars. Now there was console wars before Nintendo and Sega because you had like Atari versus ColecoVision, but when they got really serious and what I would call like the first real console wars was with Nintendo and Sega. Now, this is the 16-bit generation of game consoles, and the very interesting thing with this generation is back then, if you wanted to play Sonic or Mario or, Golden Axe or let's say Yoshi's Island or whatever, you had to buy one or the other. Both of these game consoles are completely different from each other. Sega Genesis, you have Sonic, Super Famicom, you have Mario, and you couldn't really play these games on this console, and you couldn't play those games on this console. So compared to like the 8th and 9th generation of game consoles that we have nowadays, back then in the 90s, both systems were completely different. If you wanted to play Mario and have more of a casual experience, you would go with Nintendo. And if you wanted some really hardcore, really challenging games like Altered Beast and stuff like that, you went with the Sega Genesis. So these are both two completely different systems, two completely different beasts, and this is the original, I would say, the OG game console wars. This is where console wars got serious, and this is where console wars were actually really fun. Now, with the Nintendo Super Famicom and the Sega Genesis, they both had commercials that went at each other. Sega had their commercials where Sega does what Nintendo don't, and Sega Genesis, Sega also did the whole thing where it's we have the faster, more superior console, and game consoles have done that for a long time. We saw a little bit of that with PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. We saw that with PS3 and Xbox 360. And, I like how these game consoles, these game companies used to do that. PlayStation also did this when they had Crash Bandicoot. They also did some commercials where they would, talk about the other company and be like, well, we got better games and all that. But anyway, the Sega Genesis and Super Famicom are two very fantastic consoles, and I really love both these systems, these 90s 16-bit generation consoles. The cool thing with this generation, again, is that you are getting very, very different controllers, very, very different experiences on both consoles, and I really love and enjoy the console wars between Nintendo and Sega. Now, when Sega hopped on with the Sega Genesis, they saw the success that was the NES. Nintendo had the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the Nintendo Entertainment System was a very, very, very successful game console for Nintendo. Now, Sega saw this and they were like, you know what? We're going to make a competitor, we're going to make a 16-bit console that can beat the 8-bit crap that was the Nintendo Entertainment System. So Sega was like, you know what, we're going to make the Sega Genesis. It's going to be a fast console, and it's going to have 16-bit graphics. So Sega came out with the Sega Genesis, and the Sega Genesis was going up against the NES originally. And when Sega started to, pick up on sales and started to really hit at Nintendo, you had Nintendo over there going, you know what's better than the NES? A Super NES. So they created the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo to combat the Sega Genesis. Now, I do believe when this happened, Nintendo did get a little scared at first because, the Sega Genesis is coming out. They're starting to pick up on sales. They're trying to defeat our awesome NES console. So Nintendo was like, we kind of have to make our own 16-bit console. And that's when Nintendo decided to come out with the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo. It was known as the Nintendo Super Famicom in Japan only, but for the rest of the world, it was the Super Nintendo. But I prefer Nintendo Super Famicom, honestly, and I also prefer this design. And the Sega Genesis was also known as the Sega Mega Drive in other countries. But anyway, Sega went right after Nintendo. They were like, you know what, we're going to make a superior console, we're going to make a better console. And then Nintendo came back at them with the Nintendo Super Famicom. And that is the start of the console war between Sega and Nintendo. Sadly, Sega the very last console they made was the Dreamcast, and sadly the Sega Dreamcast failed, even though it was actually a very awesome console. And Sega and Nintendo obviously are both still around to this day, but back then they were two completely different companies, two completely different beasts that you would never see a Nintendo game on a Sega console, and you would never see Sega on Nintendo. But when Sega obviously lost the war to Nintendo and obviously the upcoming PlayStation, stuff like that, Sega had no choice but to leave the console market and then just focus on video games. So then you start to see Nintendo and their game consoles start to get Sega games. So it would basically be kind of like PlayStation and Xbox, where, let's say, Xbox decides to no longer make consoles, then they would just start pushing Xbox games on PlayStation, which technically that's already happening. That's basically what happened with Nintendo and Sega, is that Sega basically lost the console war, and then their games went on other platforms. But anyway, I really like the 16-bit era of gaming, the 16-bit game consoles. I love the controllers of this generation, I love the consoles of this generation, and especially the games. Sonic and Mario, awesome games in this generation. And you can let me know in the comment section below what you think about the OG console wars between Nintendo and Sega. But I want to make this video just talking about this a little bit because I'm really interested in this generation. But now with that stuff being said and talking about the whole battle, the war between Nintendo and Sega, I want to talk about what console I prefer. Now, I am someone who is in my 20s. I wasn't lucky enough to grow up in, the 1980s and the 90s. I was born in 1999. So, when I was born, PlayStation was already out, and I really didn't get that much experience with either the Sega Genesis or Nintendo Super Famicom. However, through my journey of gaming, I became a huge collector, right? And I started to collect all kinds of consoles and games. So yes, I actually got into the NES, the Super Famicom, Super Nintendo, and of course the Sega Genesis. And from my experience with both consoles, I've had years of experience. I've used both these systems for years and years and years. What console do I prefer? What do I believe to be the best 16-bit experience in this generation? And I have to say, I'm going to go with Nintendo. Nintendo Super Famicom has some of my favorite games. Super Mario Kart, the Super Mario Collection, and it has just really awesome games. I mean, it's just a great console. So is the Sega Genesis, but I prefer games on the Nintendo Super Famicom. Sega Genesis, I do love Altered Beast, I love Golden Axe, I love Sonic, but I would have to say, if I was to choose a game console, if I was in 1990, right, I would definitely pick a Nintendo Super Famicom over the Sega Genesis. And then later on, I would pick up a Sega Genesis just to play Sonic. But anyway, I'm in this video, but tell me in the comment section below, what console would you pick up if you grew up in the 90s? Would you pick up a Super Famicom, or would you pick up the Sega Genesis? For me, though, I'm a huge Mario fan, a bigger Mario fan than Sonic, so I'd probably go with Super Famicom. Plus, I do love this controller a lot, and I love this design, actually, over that design. But anyway, I'm in this video, so I hope everyone has a lovely day or night, and peace out. But this is the 16-bit era, the original console wars. Yes, people can argue that the original could have been like Atari versus ColecoVision, but this is when things got really serious between these companies. But anyway, peace out. Oh yeah.